Welcome back to Hannity. On Saturday, thousands of police officers stood outside the church in Queens, New York, where the funeral of Officer Rafael Ramos was being held. And a few hundred of those officers turned their backs on New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio as he eulogized the fallen officer who was assassinated last week, along with his partner. And yesterday, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani said it was about time for Mayor de Blasio to apologize to the NYPD. Take a look.
I do believe Mayor de Blasio should apologize to the New York City Police Department. I said it day one, and I think he'd get this over with if he did it. I've had to apologize for things that I said that were wrong. He created an impression with the police, and I don't know that he wanted to do it. He probably didn't, but he created an impression with the police that he was on the side of the protesters. Now, some of those protesters were entirely legitimate, but some of those protesters were horrible, yelling, "Kill the police."
And earlier today, Mayor de Blasio was reportedly booed while addressing an NYPD graduation ceremony. Joining me now with reaction is former LAPD detective Mark Furman and former NYPD detective and the CEO of Bronson Risk Consultants, Pat Bronson. Now, Pat, I want to start with you. You were outside that church with all of those officers. Just tell us a little bit about how it was, what it was like, what was the atmosphere like, and what were people saying about Officer Ramos?
Well, Katie, and I certainly will. The first thing I want to do is I just want to clarify that it wasn't hundreds that turned their backs. It was thousands. It was many thousands. And the reason I know is I was there, and I saw for as far as a football field in front of one of many jumbotrons, I saw thousands and thousands of uniformed police officers of every rank turn on a dime, do an immediate 180-degree turn once Mayor de Blasio came on the jumbotron. It's a fact. Yeah, well, not hundreds, thousands.
Right. Well, can you talk to us a little bit about what the officers were saying? Why did they want to do that? What were they saying about Officer Ramos? Because they were there to remember him. You know, everyone's upset with the mayor, but really this was about remembering a great man who lost his life too soon.
Well, the mood, as are all police funerals, I've been to many of them, was extremely somber. I think more somber this time than any that I've ever seen before. And I think that has to do with the horrific circumstances of the double assassination on the 20th of December. I think it struck to the core. It put an ice pick in the heart of the NYPD as an institution. It alerted them, it horrified them to the extent of the savagery that occurred. This wasn't a gunfight on a rooftop with a bank robber.
Right.
This was two guys having a roast beef sandwich in broad daylight in a marked radio car on a quiet Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
Horrific. And I think it absolutely stilled the heart of the NYPD.
Now, Mark, there's been a lot of controversy from certain people saying that these police officers shouldn't be turning their back on the mayor, that they should respect Mayor de Blasio despite the things that he said. What do you have to say about that?
Well, first, I can't argue with one thing that Pat just described in the environment in New York. And that being said, the mayor of New York is really the leader of that city, and he needs to act like one. He needs to stop bringing in his personal views, his history, his family, and stop siding with one side or another. He represents the leadership of New York. And as far as turning the back on Mayor de Blasio, I think it was totally appropriate. They were honoring two fallen officers. The mood and the climate that the mayor allowed in the city actually contributed to everything that took place, not just the assassination of these two officers, but the civil unrest. So de Blasio doesn't get it. He will never understand the brotherhood of law enforcement. He will never be there. He will never be allowed to be there. And he needs to act like a leader and lead the men that know how to do the job. He's not doing that. It's totally appropriate.
You know, Pat, Mark just mentioned the atmosphere that was in New York City and around the country before these two police officers were executed. You know, you just wrote a very powerful op-ed on your website talking about Bill de Blasio's words. You know, what strikes me about Bill de Blasio is that he is now standing out Commissioner Bratton to say it's inappropriate for the officers to turn their backs and protest, but it seems like Bill de Blasio was perfectly okay with taking sides, and he's not liking it so much now, being on the side of being protested for the things that he said about his son, warning his son about the racist cops allegedly. I mean, you wrote all about that on your website.
It's been astonishing, Katie. I mean, since the very minute that the No True Bill was delivered in the Michael Brown shooting, Mayor de Blasio and others of the anti-police brigade have replaced common sense and logic and the rule of law with misplaced anti-police rhetoric, inflammatory, manufactured 24/7 racist propaganda. However, as he's learned, and how many others have learned from the anti-police brigade, rhetoric has consequences. You cannot dehumanize, you cannot diminish, you can't declaw a storied and noble institution like the NYPD and not think there's going to be simultaneous consequences of empowerment of these individuals who would commit crimes and who would go so far as to light the fuse that lit and caused and created an Ishmael Brinsley to get on a bus in Baltimore and come up and put bullets in the back of two guys having their lunch in broad daylight.
Right. You know, Mark, he's right. Mayor de Blasio has certainly dehumanized police officers all over the country, but specifically here in New York City. He refuses to apologize, that he continues to show up at these events and acts like he still deserves the respect that they're demanding for him. Do you think that this can even be fixed if Mayor de Blasio issues an apology? And do you think that he will actually mean it if he does apologize?
No, as far as de Blasio and the police department, it cannot be fixed because de Blasio is not the leader that the police department needs to carry out their job. They can do it completely by themselves. They don't need de Blasio to actually create problems for the police department. Just be silent and let Bratton run the police department. It'll be fine. But you have to see something here, Katie, that de Blasio thinks that an apology is what NYPD wants. They don't want that. They want to be able to exercise their job as police officers to the letter of the law for these demonstrators so they can stop these demonstrations and the attitude and the disrespect before it starts. Not what de Blasio is doing is placating and talking to these demonstrators and the leaders of these demonstrations like they somehow have a valid I guess, right to disrespect the NYPD. This is where, I mean, this is the line.
Right. As a former detective for the NYPD, do you think that Bill de Blasio should resign?
It's a very difficult question, and I concur with Mark on many levels as it relates to how much will an apology do. Listen, when you have Tawana Brawley's former senior advisor sitting at the table with someone like Commissioner Bratton, an absolute legend with 44 years in senior police command leadership roles, this becomes like Alice in Wonderland. You know, I mean, it's madness. It's completely a bizarre series of circumstances. And listen, I think the office of the mayor deserves a lot of respect. It absolutely does. Right. But so does the institution, the noble institution of the NYPD. Yeah. And that hasn't been there. And it's tremendously problematic.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us. We're obviously going to keep looking at this story.